Hello, hi. Welcome to Wayanad Literature Festival. It's such a privilege to host none other than John Keay. Welcome, John.
Thank you very
Hello.
much.
We met
I mean,
before, and it's such a pleasure to meet him again. We John Keay is not a stranger to history buffs. He's one of the world's leading historians, and I think I would like to call him as a travel writer as well, because his writing is so fascinating. So it's such a privilege for me to sit with him and have a conversation about history, about his forthcoming books, about Wayanad, about the influence of the Scottish during the British Raj here. So let's get cracking, John. Yeah.
go for it.
Yeah. Okay. And as I said, we are at a time. History is more than ever in focus now. Every country wants to redefine their history. The people want to know their identity. And as a historian, I think, how do you look at it now globally, and especially in India?
Yes, well, in India, I think history has been used perhaps almost more than anywhere else, particularly in recent years. And I was trying to think of any other country where, for instance, the school syllabus for history has been so controversial as it has here in the last few years. Most of us kind of accept our history without questioning, but in India, it's obviously a very live issue, and perhaps a historian who writes about India assumes an enormous responsibility. All I can say in my defense is that my history, India history, was actually written over 20 years ago. I mean, it's now on its third or fourth edition. It's been reprinted, republished, and translated numerous times. But it is still a book that was written in the 1990s. I think that the hot potato that Indian history has become, it wasn't so hot then.
Yeah, it was not. That's what I said. I picked one line from the India history, where you say myth, howsoever is remote, howsoever remote it is,
Yes.
it serves the needs of the moment. So
Yes,
does history,
of course.
especially in
Yes.
India. That's what you've written
Like,
20 years
yes.
ago, and we are here.
That's definitely still true. No, perhaps I would have phrased it a bit more cautiously. No, but yes, no, it's still true.
That's what I want to ask. If you were to write India history now,
Huh.
what would be your approach?
It would be different, I think, yes. I mean, since I wrote India history, I've written a similar book called China history, another 5,000-year history. And having seen Chinese attitudes towards history and towards its writing today, I would now take a slightly different tack with Indian history, I think, in that you had to stress that Indian history is very, very poorly served compared with Chinese or European history in terms of documentation. And this is perhaps even more of a problem now than it's ever been, although an awful lot of archaeological and epigraphical work has been done in the last few years. We still don't really have the source materials for India's history that we do have for Chinese or European history. And perhaps I should have stressed this a bit more, or would have stressed it a bit more if I was beginning to write India history today.
Yeah, I mean, there's another thing. So the Kenyan writer, Tuango, right? Ngugi wa Tuango. He said, what a colonizer does to the colonized, first thing is erase memory.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
rename places, rename people.
Yes.
We've seen a kind of an activity here of renaming places and streets and all that. As a historian, you come back, you've written about a place, you come back and the place has been renamed.
Yes.
I mean, how do you look at it? I mean, that's kind of
that occurred to me just yesterday when we were flying from Doha to Calicut, and they were trying to call the flight for Calicut, and there was also a flight for Calcutta. And I thought, if you wrote Calicut and Calcutta as it sounds in, say, Urdu or something, would you be able to tell which was which?
Yeah, that's true.
'Cause, and so I could see the logic of renaming places or restoring existing names, but it takes a bit of time. I mean, after all, we're still getting used to Chennai and Mumbai. It's going to be a while before Kodi Kodi catches on. And
We have a problem if it has become a part of a propaganda.
yes. I mean,
If you can rename it for, I mean, you can make it Indian, but then from the British thing, you can rename it.
yes.
But then, if if you think there is a part of a propaganda, then we have a problem. And then, as a historians mark events and people and land and all that. So, for a historian, that's my question. John, when you rename everything, it's a new country. The culture is different. So that's what I said. Is where are we going to?
Where are we going?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, as a historian, but the worst thing of all about all these respellings is if your book has an index, which any decent history has to have, that the index has to be changed every time the name of the place or the name of the person is changed. So this is one tries to keep up to this. Well, that's why my book's been through so many editions, because these are minor sort of updates, but one tries to represent whatever the mood of the moment is in terms of orthography, of spelling. I think that
you can't keep on updating a book. You can't keep on updating a history of a country, right?
Can't keep on what?
Updating the history of a country.
Betting it. Yes. Well, I mean, we all rewrite our own histories. As soon as you, with any book, as soon as you switch off your laptop and think that's it, you start rewriting it immediately, and you go on rewriting. And I always say, that a book is not written until the author is dead. Then it's fixed.
I think it was Naipaul who said on his Nobel acceptance speech that I am the sum of my books.
Yes, yes, no, that's exactly right. Yes, and what else are we?
Let's talk about floods. I'm interested because we in Kerala, we've witnessed floods in the recent years like never before.
Yes.
And in your book, History, you've mentioned about floods. Floods, he said, erase everything that is before and start anew. And if you were to write the history of Kerala, like, look, we are a people who've migrated to different parts of the world. Our architecture has lost its character. Our food culture has been invaded by so many. You can see Arabic mandi, this, then that. And so, what are we? If you were to write the history of the land and the people of Kerala, say after 100 years, how would you look at it, and who are we?
Yes. Well, I have to mention that one of the reasons I'm here is not just for the book festival, but also to do some research on a British official, Scottish official, who served here in the second half of the 19th century, called William Logan. And he, what was it? What was your question?
No. If you were to write the history of Kerala, the land, the people, how would you approach? Will that be different from William Logan's approach?
Yes.
Or how will you look at these people right now, 100 years from now?
Yes. Logan's approach was pretty simple. He said Kerala didn't have a history.
Yeah.
Because there were no historians. And I think what he was saying is that there was no documentation, that most of the materials that might have been used for record events, stone and wood and copper plates and so on, in Kerala, they were mostly on palm leaf and on timber, and so haven't lasted. And so there's a terrible shortage of documentational material for the history of Kerala. And I think that's what Logan was saying. But he said that on the other hand, where Kerala was almost unique in that he had such a rich history of communities. So many very separate, distinctive communities, Nayars, Nambudiris, and so on, and that these communities had their own history, oral mostly, obviously, and that was the only real source for history of Kerala, of Malabar. And I think he's probably right. But of course, there has, I mean, since his day, there's been quite a bit of archaeological research done in Kerala, and particularly on what we call the prehistoric period.
Muslims.
So yes, so that's no longer true. But at the time when Logan was working here, either he was aware of some of these dolmens and things, but he had no idea what they were. No one did, I think.
Yeah. Before we come back to the crux of history, let's talk about Logan and your reflections of William Logan, and, and the Scottish influence in people here, and how you were telling me that the Scottish officers were different from the British. So how can you just dwell on that a little bit?
I'm from Scotland, and Logan was from Scotland, but so were a lot of the other most senior figures in the British or the East India Company's administration in the south of India, and these people gave to the origins of colonialism here something, a quite separate dimension to what you would find in most of India and Pakistan. Logan, I mean, I must admit I never heard of Logan until Vinod Jus, who's organised this festival, said you must look into Logan. And so, and the Malabar Manual, it's a great work, a great book, which Logan was responsible for. So I went, I'd never heard of Logan, I'd never heard of the book, and did a bit of research. And eventually I found a copy of the book in the National Library of Scotland, which is about the only place where you would find it, I think. But even then, a lot of the pages in the book had not been cut, so clearly isn't much read. But on the other hand, it was a complete eye-opener for me. It was the most interesting kind of memoir, really, and gazetteer and so on, of any that I've read of British officers of that period. When Logan's describing the beauties of Wayanad and its products and so on, he takes the reader with him as if he's taking him up on a trail through the rainforest, and he keeps saying things like, "Duck your head," in the text, and in the water there, and so on. It's a kind of it's a very bizarre kind of text, but it's absolutely brilliant. And so I became very excited about the idea of Logan as being a representative voice of rule by the East India Company in the south here during the period of the East India Company in the late 18th and early 19th century. That I thought that Logan, in a way, was typical of a lot of these other very famous figures like Munro and Mountstuart, Elphiston and Malcolm and so on, who appear in all the history books. You have to remember that Scots had a slightly different attitude towards India to their English counterparts. Scotland, after all, was colonised and lost its sovereignty at exactly the same time as Bengal did in India in the mid-18th century, 1750s, 1760s. And a lot of the people Scots people who joined the East India Company after the suppression of the Scottish Parliament and so on, were in trying to regain their position in society and their income, and a lot of them lost their estates, were forfeited and so on. And they would, the one good thing about union with England in 1707 was that it meant that all these Scots who'd been penalised and so on during the rebellions against British rule could join the British Army and join the East India Company, and a lot of them indeed did so. But all of them, came with this kind of legacy of serving a government to which they were also in many ways rather opposed. Yeah. And so they tended to take a much more individualistic line towards India and to engage much more closely with Indian people and to recommend that Indians serve in the administrative services and in the army, and were altogether much more liberal in their outlook.
So that's what he said. They approached the Indians with,
yes, so it was in a way a much more, from a 21st century perspective, a much more sympathetic form of colonialism. Yeah. But it was only, most of these Scots, much the greatest concentration of them was here in the south, and particularly following the Anglo-Mysore wars of the late 18th century, when Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali had been defeated. And the British took over the administration right of the entire peninsular area, really, with the exception of Travancore. But basically, it was all run by the East India Company. And they were a surprisingly sympathetic group of people, and it seemed to me that Logan was a typical example, because Logan actually went one further and was prepared to stand up against the company. And particularly there was a very famous case, went on for several years, of how land tenure should be settled in India. Should it be done via the zamindari system, which was thought to exist in Bengal particularly, or the Rayatwari system, more peasant-based here in the south? And actually,
is that when, in that sense, you said Logan was much ahead of his time?
Yes, well, actually, because he disagreed with both these, and he thought that in terms of, certainly of Malabar, it was such a distinctive society, and he was particularly excited about the Nair caste. He described them as the parliament of the Malayalis. He disagreed with applying these other systems of land tenure to this area, and he fell out with the authorities. And eventually, in 1887, when he just finished this great work on the Malabar Manual, he retired, or was, I think, eased out and returned to Scotland, and never had anything more to do with India.
He was eased out.
Yes, so he was in disgrace, really. But because he'd taken too sympathetic a view towards existing systems of land tenure in Malabar and Kerala, so he was a bit of a black sheep. But as I say, his book is absolutely fantastic. It has everything in it. It's 2 volumes. The first are both leather-bound with beautiful maps and so on. The second volume is almost entirely listings of, like he tells, he lists every single kind of butterfly, every single kind of bird, thousand different birds.
Is that your kind of writing history? Well, I remember you.
He's writing natural history as well. He was a naturalist as well as an administrator, like a lot of them were. And,
because you said somewhere that you said don't write history books like boring,
Oh no, yes.
When you write, you bring in people, you bring in anecdotes.
Yes, that's the other thing is with history and with Logan as well, is the ability to write. I mean, there's too much history is written just for other historians and not for a general reading public.
Yes. And that's where you stand out, right?
Well, that's what I try to do. I think that if you're going to write history, the writing is just as important, if not more important, than the history. I mean, obviously the history has got to be accurate and so on, but you've got to engage the reader. And the most interesting histories are not those written by historians, in my opinion, but they're written by writers, first and foremost.
That's what I'm coming
to.
Writing history is not just documenting facts or info.
Oh,
writing history is, so my question now is, how do you distinguish between a travel writer and a historian?
Oh, well,
I mean, you've done, you kind of.
I've always used history as an excuse to travel because I enjoy traveling a lot. But you don't have to. I mean, how do you distinguish between history and journalism? I don't know. I think, Ramachandra Guha, you know who I mean? Yes, is a brilliant historian, but he probably wouldn't call himself a historian. He's a journalist or political commentator, a public intellectual, whatever. He's not first. I don't think he teaches history, does he?
No,
as far as I know. So, although he writes it, of course. So I don't think. I think there has to be. I always describe myself not as a historian, but as a history writer, and that seems to be
For
something.
example, we take V.S. Naipaul. I'm sure that he's traveled.
Who?
V.S. Naipaul.
Naipaul, yes.
Yeah, he's traveled to India. He traveled to India. Traveled to Africa.
Yes.
And he wrote about. I mean, could be biased, but can we call him a historian?
I don't think he sees himself as a historian, but he's writing. He is a travel writer first and foremost. But that doesn't mean to say that his travel writing doesn't have a rich intellectual feel to it, which some of which would certainly be due to the history that he uses. And so far as I know, his history is very reliable. But he's basically writing about contemporary societies. At least when I think of his earlier books on India, he was writing about India as it was at the time in the 1960s or whatever. But not really reflecting very much on the Harappan period, for instance.
Yeah. No, but when you get these info about, for example, Harappan, how do you piece them together into a beautiful narrative?
How do you what?
Piece them together, all the information.
How do you piece it together?
Yeah, all the information from for example, you get information from the archaeology department or the research.
Yes.
So you've got to piece them together, write into a beautiful narrative. That's where the writer kicks in, right?
Yes, I think nowadays there was a time at which if you wrote a history, you started at the beginning, the earliest date you could find, and worked through to whatever the current date was. Now the feeling is that history, all narrative, whether it's history or whether it's a novel or whatever, is very often chopped up. So that the writer and the reader are being shuffled from the past to the present and back again. I'm actually at the moment writing a history of Kashmir, and the book, each chapter in the book, about 20, deals with both a medieval period and a current period. The Kashmir dispute.
Yeah.
So I think narratives that hop about, that I call them frisky narratives, are quite acceptable nowadays. And I think the reader quite likes that. And you like to feel when you're reading about some very distant period of history that it does have some relevance to today. And it's up to the historian or history writer to highlight that.
Let's talk about a little bit about the book that you're going to write after this book, which is what you said.
Yes, well, I want to write on these Scots in the East India Company's administration in the south of India, and particularly on William Logan, because I think what I hope to discover, and I think I will, is a much more kind of sympathetic attitude towards India from the Scots who served here than amongst the English. And I think Logan is probably a very good example of that. But I have to do quite a bit of work on him before I can even begin to put together a proposal for this book.
It's kind of an investigative journalist job.
Yes,
right?
yes, there's plenty of that. So it will, and I don't know whether I'll get around to it. I mean, one of the reasons I'm here now is I want to know, are these itineraries, Logan's itineraries, still followable? Is his house was in East Hill, Calicut. Is East Hill still a house, still a public building? I mean, he was a district magistrate, so it would have been his official residence. And and you know, are there still 1,000 different birds in Wayanad alone?
You never know. Yeah.
So I'm really this visit is not just for this festival, but also to do some serious research for a book on Scottish participation in the rule of South India in the 18th and early 19th centuries.
You've written about the Himalayas.
Yes.
Yeah, you've written about the spice route.
Yes.
One is up there and down is on the sea. Yeah. How challenging and exciting were these two projects? Like one is Himalayas more recent, and the
Yes.
spice route. The history of spice route was
the book on the spice route. Was a sort of, you know, sometimes you write a book because it's your idea, and sometimes you write a book because you're asked to write it. Yeah. And in this case, I was asked to write it. There's a publisher, a rather sort of upmarket publisher called the Folio Society in the US and the UK, who do beautifully illustrated volumes. And they'd done a book on the Silk Road or Silk Roads, and they wanted a companion volume on the spice route, and they asked me if I would do it, and so I did, and I learned a lot from it. I think it's always important that you learn as much as you teach when you're writing history.
So what did you learn from that exercise of writing?
Well, actually, it was there wasn't any book on the spice route, and so that I had to construct a kind of chronological sequence for it. And obviously, there are a few crucial dates: 1498, when Vasco da Gama lands at Calicut, and the Portuguese established their Estado in India. But there are a lot of other earlier and later dates around which you could construct a narrative, and that's really what I had to do for the spice route. It wasn't particularly difficult, and of course, it's a delightful subject, and also dealing with an exotic commodity means that you're not necessarily dealing just with people all the time, but you're dealing with cooking and everything else that's involved with spice. So for me, it was a welcome change. You mentioned the Himalaya book that was published 2 years ago, and that was a bit of a labour of love. That was very much my own idea, because I've spent quite a lot of time in that part of the world, and also written on Tibet and China and so on. I wanted to try and restore the idea that Himalaya was a distinct kind of ecosystem in its own right, and that it deserves all the respect we can give it academically, intellectually, but also in terms of preserving the environment, which is one of the most endangered in the world, probably is the most endangered. So the motivation for the Himalaya book was quite different, if I go ahead with this book on South India and the Scots, that again will be much more kind of personal, more like the Himalaya book, and less choreographed in terms of chronology, I hope.
John, I just want to pick your brain a little bit for the sake of my personal interest. So, if you were to travel on a time machine,
yes,
would you like to go into the future or into the past, and why?
Well, definitely not the future. I think the future really looks grim at the moment. I'm just reading a book on nuclear proliferation, and that's pretty depressing reading. So this is a bad time to be looking into the future. Into the past, I think I'd go well back. I think I'd probably go back, I mean, it sounds a bit obvious, back to the Gupta period in Indian history, say the 4th, 5th, 6th century CE. A new book on the Gupta gold coinage, the gold coins of the Guptas. And I thought, wow, any society that could have produced these amazing coins must have been fantastic. And then I think Kalidasa, I mean, we'd love to know more about Kalidasa. And, it's thought that he lived under the Guptas, and then all those temples and sculptures and so on that started to be produced on a big scale in India during the Gupta period. So I think that would be a pretty exciting period. I mean, who knows what you want me to be reborn as. I mean, I'd quite like to be a king, if it's all right.
Oh, yeah.
If it's all right by you, Sabin.
Or a historian, but he also is a king. So there'll be a historian to write about you. Yeah.
So instead of writing history, I could make it.
Yeah, it's lovely. So it's so good to have you here, John. It's a pleasure talking to you. It's a privilege for me personally.
Oh, for me too.
Again, and good luck with the next two books.
Thank you very much.
Kashmir, one on
Thank you.
the Scottish impact and influence on.
Yes, when that book comes out, I shall certainly have to come back to Wayanad
of course,
for the Wayanad Literary Festival.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Sir.